1919. Except for World War II, nothing ever interfered with the celebration of National Suicide Day. It had taken place every January 3rd since 1920, although Shadrach, its founder, was for many years the only celebrant. Blasted and permanently astonished by the events of 1917, he had returned to Medallion handsome but ravaged, and even the most fastidious people in the town sometimes caught themselves dreaming of what he must have been like a few years back before he went off to war. A young man of hardly 20, his head full of nothing in his mouth, recalling the taste of lipstick, Shadrach had found himself in December 1917, running with his comrades across a field in France. It was his first encounter with the enemy, and he didn't know whether his company was running toward them or away. For several days they had been marching, keeping close to a stream that was frozen at its edges. At one point they crossed it, and no sooner had he stepped foot on the other side than the day was a dangle with shouts and explosions. Shell fire was all around him, and though he knew that this was something called it, he could not muster up the proper feeling, the feeling that would accommodate it. He expected to be terrified or exhilarated, to feel something very strong. In fact, he felt only the bite of a nail in his boot, which pierced the ball of his foot whenever he came down on it. The day was cold enough to make his breath visible, and he wondered for a moment at the purity and whiteness of his own breath among the dirty, gray explosions surrounding him. He ran, bayonet fixed, deep in the great sweep of men flying across this field. Wincing at the pain in his foot, he turned his head a little to the right and saw the face of a soldier near him fly off. Before he could register shock, the rest of the soldier's head disappeared under the inverted soup bowl of his helmet. But stubbornly, taking no direction from the brain, the body of the headless soldier ran on with energy and grace, ignoring altogether the drip and slide of brain tissue down his back. When Shadrach opened his eyes, he was propped up in a small bed. Before him on a tray was a large tin plate divided into 3 triangles. In one triangle was rice, in another meat, and in the third stewed tomatoes. A small round depression held a cup of whitish liquid. Shadrach stared at the soft colors that filled these triangles. The lumpy whiteness of rice, the quivering blood tomatoes, the grayish-brown meat. All the repugnance was contained in the neat balance of the triangles, a balance that soothed him, transferred some of its equilibrium to him. Thus reassured that the white, the red, and the brown would stay where they were, would not explode or burst forth from the restricted zones, he suddenly felt hungry and looked around for his hands. His glance was cautious at first, for he had to be very careful. Anything could be anywhere. Then he noticed 2 lumps beneath the beige blanket on either side of his hips. With extreme care, he lifted one arm and was relieved to find his hand attached to his wrist. He tried the other and found it also. Slowly he directed one hand toward the cup, and just as he was about to spread his fingers, they began to grow in higgledy-piggledy fashion like Jack's beanstalk all over the tray and the bed. With a shriek, he closed his eyes and thrust his huge growing hands under the covers. Once out of sight, they seemed to shrink back to their normal size. But the yowl had brought a male nurse. "Private? We're not going to have any trouble today, are we? Are we, Private?" Shadrach looked up at the balding man, dressed in a green cotton jacket and trousers. His hair was patted low on the right side so that some 20 or 30 yellow hairs could discreetly cover the nakedness of his head. "Come on, pick up that spoon. Pick it up, Private. Nobody's going to feed you forever." Sweat slid from Shadrach's armpits down his sides. He could not bear to see his hands grow again, and he was frightened of the voice in the apple-green suit. "Pick it up," I said. "There's no point to this." The nurse reached under the cover for Shadrach's wrist to pull out the monstrous hand. Shadrach jerked it back and overturned the tray. In panic, he raised himself to his knees and tried to fling off and away his terrible fingers, but succeeded only in knocking the nurse into the next bed. When they bound Shadrach into a straitjacket, he was both relieved and grateful, for his hands were at last hidden and confined to whatever size they had attained. Laced and silent in a small bed, he tried to tie the loose cords in his mind. He wanted desperately to see his own face and connect it with the word private, the word the nurse and the others who helped to bind him had called him. Private, he thought, was something secret, and he wondered why they looked at him and called him a secret. Still, if his hands behaved as they had done, what might he expect from his face? The fear and longing were too much for him, so he began to think of other things. That is, he let his mind slip into whatever cave mouths of memory it chose. He saw a window that looked out on a river which he knew was full of fish. Someone was speaking softly just outside the door. Shadrach's earlier violence had coincided with the memorandum from the hospital executive staff in reference to the distribution of patients in high-risk areas. There was clearly a demand for space. The priority or the violence earned Shadrach his release. $217 in cash, a full suit of clothes, and copies of very official-looking papers. When he stepped out of the hospital door, the grounds overwhelmed him. The cropped shrubbery, the edged lawns, the undeviating walks. Shadrach looked at the cement stretches, each one leading clear-headedly to some presumably desirable destination. There were no fences, no warnings, no obstacles at all between concrete and green grass, so one could easily ignore the tidy sweep of stone and cut out in another direction, a direction of one's own. Shadrach stood at the foot of the hospital steps, watching the heads of trees tossing ruefully but harmlessly, since their trunks were rooted too deeply in the earth to threaten him. Only the walks made him uneasy. He shifted his weight, wondering how he could get to the gate without stepping on the concrete. While plotting his course, where he would have to leap, where to skirt a clump of bushes, a loud guffaw startled him. Two men were going up the steps, then he noticed that there were many people about, and that he was just now seeing them, or else they had just materialized. There were thin slips like paper dolls floating down the walks. Some were seated in chairs with wheels propelled by other paper figures from behind. All seemed to be smoking, and their arms and legs curved in the breeze. A good high wind pulled them up and away, and they would land perhaps among the tops of the trees. Shadrach took the plunge, 4 steps, and he was on the grass heading for the gate. He kept his head down to avoid seeing the paper people swerving and bending here and there, and he lost his way. When he looked up, he was standing by a low red building separated from the main building by a covered walkway. From somewhere came a Swedish smile which reminded him of something painful. He looked around for the gate and saw that he had gone directly away from it in his complicated journey over the grass. Just to the left of the low building was a graveled driveway that appeared to lead outside the grounds. He trotted quickly to it and left, at last, a haven of more than a year, only 8 days of which he fully recollected. Once on the road, he headed west. The long stay in the hospital had left him weak, too weak to walk steadily on the gravel shoulders of the road. He shuffled, grew dizzy, stopped for breath, started again, stumbling and sweating but refusing to wipe his temples, still afraid to look at his hands. Passengers in dark, square cars shuttered their eyes at what they took to be a drunken man. The sun was already directly over his head when he came to a town, a few blocks of shaded streets, and he was already at its heart, a pretty, quietly regulated downtown. Exhausted, his feet clotted with pain, he sat down at the curbside to take off his shoes. He closed his eyes to avoid seeing his hands and fumbled with the laces of the heavy, high-topped shoes. The nurse had tied them into a double knot, the way one does for children, and Shadrach, long accustomed to the manipulation of intricate things, could not get them loose. Uncoordinated, his fingernails tore away at the knots. He fought a rising hysteria that was not merely anxiety to free his aching feet. His feet life depended on the release. His very life depended on the release of the knots. Suddenly, without raising his eyelids, he began to cry. 22 years old, weak, hot, frightened, not daring to acknowledge the fact that he didn't even know who or what he was, with no past, no language, no tribe, no source, no address book, no comb, no pencil, no clock, no pocket handkerchief, no rug, no bed, no can opener, no faded postcard, no soap, no key, no tobacco pouch, no soiled underwear, nothing to do. He was sure of one thing only, the unchecked monstrosity of his hands. He cried soundlessly at the curbside of a small Midwestern town, wondering where the window was, and the river, and the soft voices just outside the door. Through his tears he saw the fingers joining the laces tentatively at first, and rapidly. The 4 fingers of each hand fused into the fabric, knotted themselves, and zigzagged in and out of the tiny eye holes. By the time the police drove up, Shadrach was suffering from a blinding headache, which was not abated by the comfort he felt when the policeman pulled his hands away from what he thought was a permanent entanglement with his shoelaces. They took him to jail, booked him for vagrancy and intoxication, and locked him in a cell. Lying on a cot, Shadrach could only stare helplessly at the wall, so paralyzing was the pain in his head. He lay in this agony for a long while, and then realized he was staring at the painted-over letters of a command to fuck himself. He studied the phrase as the pain in his head subsided. Like moonlight stealing under a window shade, an idea insinuated itself. His earlier desire to see his own face, he looked for a mirror. There was none. Finally, keeping his hands carefully behind his back, he made his way to the toilet bowl and peeped in. The water was unevenly lit by the sun, so he could make nothing out of it. He could make nothing out. Returning to his cot, he took the blanket and covered his head, rendering the water dark enough to see his reflection. There in the toilet water he saw a grave black face. He had been harboring a skittish apprehension that he was not real, that he didn't exist at all, but when the blackness greeted him with its indisputable presence, he wanted nothing more. In his joy, he took the risk of letting one edge of the blanket drop and glanced at his hands. They were still, courteously still. Shadrach rose and returned to the cot, where he fell into the first sleep of his new life, a sleep deeper than the hospital drugs, deeper than the pits of plumes, steadier than the condor's wing, more tranquil than the curve of eggs. That says steadier than the condor's wings, deeper than the pits of plums. The sheriff looked through the bars at the young man with the matted hair. He had read through his prisoner's papers and hailed a farmer. When Shadrach awoke, the sheriff handed him back his papers and escorted him to the back of a wagon. Shadrach got in, and in less than 3 hours he was back in Medallion, for he had been only 22 miles from his window, his river, and his soft voices just outside the door. In the back of the wagon, supported by sacks of squash and hills of pumpkins, Shadrach began a struggle that was to last for 12 days, a struggle to order and focus experience. It had to do with making a place for fear as a way of controlling it. He knew the smell of death and was terrified of it, for he could not anticipate it. It was not death or dying that frightened him, but the unexpectedness of both. And sorting it all out, he hit on the notion that if one day a year were devoted to it, everybody could get it out of the way and the rest of the year would be safe and free. In this manner, he instituted National Suicide Day. On the third day of the new year, he walked through the bottom-down Carpenter's Road with the cowbell and a hangman's rope, calling the people together, telling them that this was their only chance to kill themselves or each other. At first, the people in the town were frightened. They knew Shadrach was crazy, but that did not mean that he didn't have any sense, or even more important, that he had no power. His eyes were so wild, his hair so long and matted, his voice was so full of authority and thunder that he caused panic on the first, or charter, National Suicide Day in 1920. The next one in 1921 was less frightening but still worrisome. The people had seen him a year now in between. He lived in a shack on the riverbank that had once belonged to his grandfather, long time dead. On Tuesday and Friday, he sold the fish he had caught that morning. The rest of the week he was drunk, loud, obscene, funny, and outrageous. But he never touched anybody, never fought, never caressed. Once the people understood the boundaries and nature of his madness, they could fit him, so to speak, into the scheme of things. Then, on subsequent National Suicide Days, the grown people looked out from behind curtains as he rang his bell. A few stragglers increased their speed, and little children screamed and ran. The tetherheads tried goading him, although he was only 4 or 5 years older than they, but not for long, for his curses were stingingly personal. As time went along, the people took less notice of January 3rds, or rather they thought they did, thought they had no attitudes or feelings one way or another about Shadrach's annual solitary parade. In fact, they had simply stopped remarking on the holiday because they had absorbed it into their thoughts, into their language, into their lives. Someone said to a friend, "You sure was a long time delivering that baby. How long was you in labor?" And the friend answered, "About 3 days. The pain started on Suicide Day and kept up till the following Sunday. Was born on Sunday. All my boys are Sunday boys." Some lover said to his bride-to-be, "Let's do it after New Year's instead of before. I get paid New Year's Eve." And his sweetheart answered, "Okay, but make sure it ain't on Suicide Day. I ain't about to be listening to no cowbells whilst the wedding going on." Somebody's grandmother said her hens always started a laying of double yolks right after Suicide Day. Then Reverend Deal took it up, saying the same folks who had sense enough to avoid Shadrach's call were the ones who insisted on drinking themselves to death or womanizing themselves to death. May as well go on with Shad and save the lamb the trouble of redemption. Easily, quietly, Suicide Day became a part of the fabric of life up in the bottom of Medallion, Ohio.